All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. It's so great to have everyone here tonight. My name is Indra Mungal. I work in the education department here at the Asian Art Museum. And it is towards the end of Lunar New Year and Black History Month, and we hope that you have had a wonderful month of... We've had great programs here. You can check them out on YouTube. And before we begin, I wanted to make the acknowledgement that the Asian Art Museum is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants and indigenous stewards of the San Francisco Peninsula. Our next At the Table program will be with Cafe Ohlone and the two founders, Vincent Medina and Luis Trevino. That'll be on April 12th, so we hope you'll join us for that. We've been doing programming and looking at deeper relationship with local Ohlone community. So this is exciting. Oh, before I introduce Kristina, if anyone is in need of assisted listening devices, we have those in the back of the room, and our tech crew, if you raise your hand, they'll bring one over to you and they'll set it up. It's super easy and very helpful. So what better recipe than dumplings for Lunar New Year, right? So we will learn to make these shumai dumplings in the shape of roses, and if you didn't get the recipe at the back of the room, you can grab one and follow along. This recording will also be on YouTube after tonight's program by next week, so you can revisit it 1,000,000 times and tell all your friends. Also, Kristina's book, Kristina Cho's first cookbook, and a baked goods book, is Mooncakes and Milk Bread. We had a few copies in the store, but I think we're almost sold out, and I think there might be 2 or 3 copies left down there. And she will talk to you about where else you can purchase the books. So, Kristina Cho is a first-generation Chinese-American who grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and spent a lot of her childhood at her family's Chinese restaurant. As an adult, just a few years, how long ago? A couple years ago?
Just like a couple years into it.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, you moved to San Francisco and found a new home in the Inner Richmond neighborhood where I grew up. And her food blog, Eat Cho Food, which is fantastic, began as a creative outlet that eventually grew to a point where she quit her job in architecture, that's a whole story unto itself, to pursue cooking and recipe development full-time. The Mooncakes and Milk Bread cookbook is her first cookbook. It's a joyful celebration of Chinese culture and the bakeries that bring little sweetness to Chinatowns across the country. And maybe we'll even have some talk about your travels to Florence, etc. So this is going to be somewhat informal tonight as Kristina's cooking. She'll ask if you have questions. A lot of times audience members want to know a little bit more like, can I make these dumplings gluten-free or pork-free, or so you can answer those. But let's give a warm San Francisco welcome to Kristina Cho, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight and watching me make dumplings in this very, very beautiful space. I'm really excited to show you guys how to make rose sumite. It's one of my favorite recipes to make because it looks really impressive, but it's really not that hard. And I probably say that really often, but this recipe is really not that hard compared to making, like typical pleated dumplings. And you might be wondering why there are rose sumite in a book about Chinese baking. So my cookbook, Mooncakes and Milk Bread, is the very first book to comprehensively cover Chinese baking and give it the recognition and limelight that it really deserves. I wanted to showcase how diverse Chinese bakeries are. Not all items in a Chinese bakery are baked at all. You see a lot of steamed buns, fried breads, and if you're lucky enough, and there's plenty of bakeries here, but you can go to a bakery and get a steamed bun, a sponge cake, and then like a container of dumplings. It's like one of my favorite things about finding a bakery like that. And so I wanted to showcase that kind of facet of Chinese baking or Chinese bakeries and how you can find a lot of savory things. I also think that making dumplings, getting comfortable with making dough and shaping it into different forms is a really great kind of beginner recipe for you if you're a little scared to make some type of yeasted dough. Making this it's really foolproof, like just flour and water, but once you make it a few times, you're gonna start to really understand and feel what dough should feel like, what a good hydrated dough should feel like, and that those skills will only translate once you kind of go to a few more elaborate recipes like the milk bread, which is it's a foundational recipe in my book, of course, and steamed buns and a lot of other things like that. So that's why we're going to be making dumplings today. There's going to be a few moments where there might be like some time for you guys to ask some questions, and like I'll announce that like maybe while we're kneading dough or rolling some dumplings. I want this to be as interactive as possible. You don't have to just like silently watch me as I like fumble around with dough. So feel free to ask any questions that you want. If it's about the recipe, if it's about the book, or if it's about growing up in Ohio and quitting my job and all that type of stuff. I am an open book, literally, so I'm here to answer your questions. So I guess we can just get started. The first thing we're going to do is make our dough. I typically always make my dough first because you want to give it some time to rest. And you do that for pretty much any type of dough because as dough rests, the hydration in there is going to kind of permeate your flour and it's going to get really nice and soft and kind of luscious. So to start, if the quantities look a little small to you, I am actually making a half batch, but I will be teaching it as like a full batch with quantities. So in a mixing bowl here, I have 300 grams of all-purpose flour, and that's going to make like 32 regular dumplings, the rose sumite, depending on how many wrappers you can get out of it. You can potentially make 32, might end up being like 26 or something like that. And I'm using a digital scale here because it will give you the most consistent results. If you're beginning to make a lot of recipes that are so reliant on flour and water, like if you're making pasta, a digital scale just removes any error because everyone scoops flour a little differently. Some people tend to pack too much in there. That's pretty typical. But I will say that my grandma, who I have learned a lot of recipes from, doesn't measure a single thing. And if she does measure something, it's with this like old coffee mug that I think I measured it one time. It's like 1.25 cup. But that just means like intuition doesn't happen instantly. Once you now I can probably measure by eye because I've made this so many times, but in the beginning, a digital scale will be a lifesaver. So 300 grams, that's about like 2.25 cups in there. And then we're gonna add just like a pinch of salt for just a little bit of seasoning. And then on a scientific level, salt also inhibits gluten formation a little bit in your dough. So when you roll out your wrappers, it's gonna stay put. It's not gonna stretch back or bounce back or anything like that. So I like to add that salt. And then for a little bit of color, you can see on the pamphlets how the roses are this really beautiful golden yellow color. I don't add gel food coloring to much anything, but I like to use kind of natural ingredients to bring some color. So I'm using some turmeric here. And if you want a really vibrant yellow color, you can add a teaspoon of turmeric. If you want a little more gentle pale yellow, then do a half. You can kind of adjust it. And some other natural food colorings that you could do would be smoked paprika. It will give your roses a beautiful orange color. If you are kind of a health nut and have beetroot powder in your cabinet, you can use that too, and it'll make it really nice and pink or red. Okay, so that's it for our dry ingredients. And you're just gonna use a whisk and mix that up. And you're gonna see just a kind of a tinge of color in your flour, but it will change color once you add your water. So I have some hot water here. I had some water boiling and it's probably been sitting for a few minutes, but it's important to use hot water. It doesn't need to be rapidly boiling, but hot water is going to do a lot of work in your dough, so you don't need to knead this for like 10 minutes. It's only going to be about a 5-minute knead. And then hot water also kind of like shocks the dough or the flour a little bit. So again, we're inhibiting gluten formation. So it's a very like workable dough. Okay. So to 300 grams of flour, we're going to add 170 grams of hot water. It's a little bit more than half by weight. Almost there. Cool. Okay. And you can see that the water is already changing color there. So our spice is working. And then you want to use a flexible spatula or a chopsticks. My grandma, because she's intense, she just goes in straight with her hands and doesn't feel the heat of the hot water anymore. But use something to protect your fingers until you're an old Asian grandma and can handle that. So you're going to mix this up. You guys can see that. And once it starts to look shaggy like this, then you can go in with your hands. Just like a few quick mixes is going to like allow that heat to like cool down a little bit and escape. But if it is a little hot, just let it like chill out for a minute or two. Okay. Now the kneading part. When you knead, you should feel a little bit of heat in your arm, like in your like arm muscle. Like you should put some oomph into it. If your arm doesn't like feel like you don't feel something in it, then you need to knead harder. So what I like to do, I want to use my fingertips and kind of pinch the dough together. Everything's kind of like loose individual pieces right now. So use your fingertips, pinch them together until you start to see it come into a cohesive dough ball. Okay. So that's like the majority of it. And then you can start using the pressure of your palm to get more oomph into there. So press down, fold the dough in half onto itself, and press down and really put some effort into there. And you're gonna knead in the bowl. I typically like to knead in the bowl until all of like the loose like scraps of flour have been incorporated into the dough ball. Okay. Excellent. So once it's like this, and like if you have a little bit of flour, that's okay. It's not going to make a big difference. I'm going to take it out of the bowl, and then on a cutting board or whatever work surface, like your countertop, we're going to knead for a few minutes until our dough is smooth-ish. It does not, if you want to keep it going and like make it a perfectly like flawless dough ball, you can do that. But we used hot water here, and we're going to let it rest for at least half an hour. It can go even longer, and so you can just save yourself some time. And look for more of a texture that's like the moon, and that will make a little bit more sense as we're kneading. You can see already how vibrant that dough is. Okay? And while I'm kneading, you want to kind of like tear the dough a little bit. Really work it through. Okay. And I used to teach a lot of virtual dumpling workshops in the past, and during this step with my students, I would kind of do like troubleshooting with people wherever they lived. And especially if you didn't use a digital scale, because you can definitely do it. There are some indicators that you want to look for as you're making this. You can see here how my hands, like, it's not covered in dough right now. Like, it's pretty clean. That means it's like a really good hydration level. And it's also not flaking apart right now. If your hands are sticky while you're kneading, it's overhydrated. And so you want to add like a tablespoon of flour at a time. Just add 1 tablespoon, work it in, see what happens. And if it starts to kind of look like this, like tacky and Play-Doh, then you're good. Maybe you need another tablespoon or so. If it's really crumbly, really firm, then it's underhydrated. So what you want to do is you can kind of like pat it into a round like this, or put it back in your bowl and add another tablespoon of water and try to knead it back in there. So those are just some things you want to look for if you're not using a scale. Okay, so this dough looks pretty good. I'm going to pat it into a ball, and what I do, so I pat it into a ball, and then I'm going to kind of like smooth that surface a little bit, kind of pull it under, pinch and pull. And so it's smooth-ish. It has like still some texture to it. Craters. Looks like the moon or a cheese ball in this case because it's yellow. And And that's fine, but it feels really nice and soft at this point. Like it still has some movement. We're gonna let it rest for at least 30 minutes, but you can let it go up to 2 hours. 1 to 2 hours is sort of like my go-to. The longer you let it rest, the more your dough is going to hydrate and get that really like smooth, luscious texture. I would not let it go for more than 2 hours, especially if you live in a really humid environment, because the longer you let it rest, it's potentially can overhydrate and become really sticky, so you have kind of like that window to work with it. Okay, and I'm just wrapping it in plastic wrap, and you can just set it anywhere, just right there. So that's our dough. Next, we are gonna make our really, really delicious dumpling filling. And Sumite is typically made, there's kind of different varieties out there, but it's typically made with shrimp and pork. That's like an incredible combination of proteins that you see a lot in Chinese cooking. If you wanted to make this with like just pork or just shrimp, you can definitely do that. Or if you want to kind of experiment with like ground chicken or something, definitely do it. I'm always very encouraging of people kind of like finding their own way with these recipes, as long as you kind of follow the general guideline of how much protein to aromatics and seasonings there are in there. But here I have 50-50 shrimp and pork, using just ground pork here. But if you wanted to be extra luxurious, you can go to your butcher shop and get like a boneless like pork rib roast cut that has like really nice fat marbling. I did that for Lunar New Year, and I was like, I should do this all the time. It's really, really great flavor. But otherwise, ground pork is totally great. So 1/2 pound of pork, 1/2 pound of shrimp that I just chopped up. If you wanted to use a food processor, you can, but I prefer to cut my shrimp by hand so you get a better texture. With a food processor, even though you pulse it like a few times, I think it gets a little too minced, and I like kind of the bigger cuts that you get from a knife. So into here, we're gonna add some green onions, about 3 cut up, but this is something that you can like measure with your heart, like how much green onions you like, just add whatever you want. Cool. And then for our seasonings, we are gonna add like 1/2 teaspoon of just coarse salt here. Then 1/2 teaspoon of ground white pepper. If you only have black pepper, you can do that too. Some people have like not great feelings about white pepper, so if you don't like it, then swap it out for something else, but I really like white pepper. And then we're gonna add some sugar. What the sugar is gonna do, it's gonna complement like all of like the savory flavors that we're gonna add in here in a little bit. So we're just gonna add like a teaspoon of sugar. And also shrimp has kind of like that natural like salinity and like sweetness, and the sugar in here is really going to enhance that and make it really delicious. Okay, and then oyster sauce. This is like my mom's secret ingredient to everything. She like puts it in her salsa and her pasta salad. Like she adds it to everything. It sounds crazy, but it adds that like umami, sweet, saltiness. So I also add it to everything, just like this. So we're gonna add 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce to this. If you can't have oyster sauce, they have, I've never used it, but they have like a mushroom oyster sauce as like an alternative. I haven't tried it, but instead of this, you can also just use like soy sauce, maybe up the sweetness a little bit, like add a little bit more sugar, because oyster sauce is naturally a little sweet. So there's alternatives out there. Okay, and that's it. And so I'm not adding a binder to this because we have that pork. If I was only gonna make like a shrimp dumpling, I would add a binder like cornstarch, maybe an egg in there, but pork has kind of like a texture that helps everything hold together. So no binder here. Does anyone have any questions while I mix this for a little bit?
Oh, here's one.
I was just wondering, are there any ways to make this vegetarian?
Yeah. So whenever I make a vegetarian dumpling filling, my mind goes to like mushrooms, if you really like mushrooms, or like a really firm tofu. I think for this, if you cook down like a bunch of mushrooms and made almost kind of like a, I don't know, like a not pate texture, but you like cook it down so it kind of has the resemblance of like a little bit of ground meat in there. I actually have made like a mushroom and pork sumite before, but you could do all mushroom in there, and that would definitely need a binder. Like I would actually probably add some like cornstarch and another bulky vegetable like cabbage or something just to give it some body and texture. So I think it'd be good too. Or you could use, like if you're into like the alternative meats like Impossible or Beyond, I think that would be good too. Awesome. So once it's mixed up, it should start to smell good. I don't know if people in the front row can like smell it now, but once you're done mixing it, and everything should be like evenly dispersed. Like you shouldn't have one section that's like only shrimp and one section's only pork. And making the recipe, like you should trust that it tastes really good, but if you're ever really curious to test the seasoning, the salty level, especially if you're experimenting, you can take like a little bit of filling and like fry it up like a little like meatball or like a little patty. My mom would always do that for my brother and I when she made dumplings, and it's like a good little snack before you spend a long time making dumplings. Cool. So I'm gonna set these back here. And our dough still needs to keep resting, but I do have a little dough ball right here that's been resting for about 2 hours, so it should have a really, really great texture here. It's a little smaller, it's about half of what I just made there. So we're gonna unwrap it. And it's visually not gonna change too much, but the texture of it should feel really luscious. Like, I don't know, it just feels really soft and satisfying, just like that. It shouldn't be tough. Like you should not have to put too much pressure to like change the shape of it. Okay, so let me move this over. We're gonna get to the fun part where we make some dumpling wrappers. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how you came upon the idea of making them the rose.
Oh yeah.
Shape.
So I did not invent this. I have seen buns and like different bread, just like lots of different foods that have been formed into like the rose shape. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but I was like really into origami as a kid and just like wanted to like figure out how to make like these types of shapes. And so, and once I figured out that it's really just 3 dumpling wrappers that are like kind of rolled up together like that easily, it was just like blew my mind away. And so I really wanted to incorporate that idea into this book. There's actually a steamed bun recipe that does the same thing. It's a brown sugar and sweet potato rose steamed bun. I think just learning these types of techniques, especially if you're really into being creative and like working with your hands, it just expands the different capabilities you can do in the kitchen. You know, dumplings don't only need to look like dumplings. Dough's really fun to work with. Cool. So we are gonna run this dough through a pasta roller. If you don't have a pasta roller, you can still do this. It just takes a little bit more patience, some good surface area, and a big rolling pin. But for these dumplings, especially because we're assembling 3 wrappers next to each other, it's best for the wrappers to be like relatively thin so your dumplings aren't too like doughy. It's just a better eating experience. So a pasta roller helps achieve that because you can get it really, really thin. You don't want to go too far that it starts to like break. Like you shouldn't be able to see through it. So we're gonna cut our dough into just like smaller pieces. If you were making the full batch, I typically cut it into like 4 or 6, depending on like where I am, if I have a lot of counter space to kind of lay these sheets of pasta out. Okay. And for a piece of dough like this, we're just gonna get it started for the pasta roller by just flattening it with the palm of your hand. And we're gonna start on the lowest setting. Lowest meaning like the thickest setting, and then we're gonna gradually work our way to something a little thinner. So at home, I have a KitchenAid one. This is a hand crank, of course. You can use either one. So we're gonna run it through the thickest. Nice. After one pass, we're gonna go to another level. And with each pass, your dough is gonna get like a little smoother. If you get a little texture on the first one, it will go away. Cool. This is also another great time if you have questions. I'm going to take this up to like the third or second lowest setting.
Kristina, I actually don't have a question. I just wanted to tell you, my 32-year-old son and I have been making your recipes together.
Oh, I love it.
And even initially they might look a little wonky, but they're always so delicious. So I just wanted to let you know that you're sort of creating memories for my son and I.
Oh, I love that so much. That's definitely one of, do you have a favorite recipe that you've made?
Don Tot?
Okay, those are really, really good.
Can you tell us what that is?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So if you don't know what a Don Tot is a custard egg tart. You typically find it at dim sum, or at least that's where I always ate it. In Cleveland, we had like one dim sum spot, and my grandparents' house was literally 1 block from it, so we went there like every Sunday, and at the end, my mom would be the one like chasing down the cart with like Don Tots so that we can have like a ton at our table. But they're really delicious. They have like this kind of like, not flan, but like it's like a silky egg custard, and the pastry. I prefer the flaky pastry compared to like the short crust pastry, but they make two in like whatever one you like. I think they're both really delicious. And there's nothing better than making it at home yourself because it's like fresh. You don't have to share it with anyone. They're really, really amazing. And thank you for sharing that memory. That was one of my intentions with writing the book, of course, because I feel like baking at home or home baking is a relatively new tradition in a lot of like Asian American families. At least for me, when I was writing the book, I was reflecting a lot about like, how did I learn how to bake? And when I was like 13 and living in Ohio, I kind of like commandeered the kitchen and would teach myself how to make like cheesecakes and brownies and chocolate chip cookies, like things that I would see like my friends eat or I would see on like Food Network. And it was also the only time that I was like left alone in the kitchen. If I was going in there to make like spring rolls or something, I would have like 5 people in my ear telling me like how I should do this according to their opinion. But like no one knew how to make a brownie. So I was just like alone and it was awesome. And so I was just like thinking about that. I'm like, I spent so much of my upbringing making these like different, like, I guess, like, like, Chinese-centric recipes. And I have really loved that since this book is out, there's families out there making Don Tot or learning how to make bao and, like, steam cakes together and has kind of had this, like cooking together, savory cooking in Asian cultures and lots of other cultures has been part of their life for so long, but maybe baking hasn't. And so it's very cool to see it become a little bit more popular. Cool. Oh, so I have 1 sheet of dough here, and I have a paintbrush. I always feel like I'm like digging up bones or a dinosaur or something, but I'm just dusting this with cornstarch. When I'm making regular dumplings, I don't make it so fussy like this, but if you're going so far as making your dumplings look like roses, there's a few different steps to like ensure that your dumpling wrappers are clean and you get a nice shape. If I'm just making regular dumpling wrappers, I don't like put cornstarch or extra flour on it. I just make the wrappers one at a time. But here I'm cutting out a bunch of wrappers like sequentially, and people will naturally want to start stacking your dumpling wrappers on top of each other. But you should not do that unless you're prepared to dust them with cornstarch. I've gotten like tons of emails telling me like, Kristina, my beautiful stack of dumpling wrappers have adhered to each other. And that's because they didn't use cornstarch. If you only use flour, it will eventually stick to each other, okay? So cornstarch is the only thing that will prevent that. You notice that too when you go to the store and you find pre-made dumpling wrappers. They're coated in cornstarch for that exact reason. So that's what we're doing here. All right, so now we're gonna cut out our wrappers. These wrappers are relatively on the small-ish side. You want something that's like 2.5, 2.75. If your cookie cutter is a little bigger, then your dumplings will just be a little bigger, and that's fine. So you're gonna take your cookie cutter, apply some pressure. Then, can you see that? Yeah. And then you have one dumpling wrapper. Now you're just going to repeat this with the rest of your dough. And so for each rose, you need 3. So you want to keep that in mind. And you're naturally going to get a few, or a decent amount of scraps here. And you can just re-knead that and roll it out in your pasta maker again. It's totally fine. Okay. So I have enough to make 2 dumplings. Perfect. Okay. Now I said this about the last time, but this is really the fun part when we roll up our dumplings. So on the side, I just have like a little cup here, and I'm gonna add a little bit of water. And the water is gonna be like our adhesive, our glue. Wherever you touch the dumpling wrapper with a little bit of water, it's gonna be sticky and stick to your other dough. Then we have our filling here. Okay, making sure I have it. Okay. So you have 3 in a row right here. And I'm just gonna dab my fingers in water. And on the right edge of our first wrapper, we're gonna dab it with water, then overlap that wrapper, kind of like a little Venn diagram. You're gonna do that again, right here. Press down. So now you have 3 wrappers that are attached to each other. Now you're gonna use like a little spoon, whatever utensil feels right to you, and we're gonna scoop some of our filling. So you wanna adjust the filling to, like everyone makes dumplings a little differently. You wanna adjust the filling based on the size of your dumpling wrapper, how your dough is behaving, like maybe it's a little thin, so don't put too much in there. But for the recipe, I do like a 1.5 tablespoons or so. I just like to remind people not to underfill your dumplings, because I don't think they eat as well. You want to have a nice amount of filling in here. Okay. So you're placing the filling in kind of like a log form down the center of your wrappers. Okay. And then we're going to fold the bottom edge over, kind of like hot dog style. I don't know if that makes sense, but you're going to fold it over. Okay. Like that. It looks like 3 baby tacos attached to each other. And then you're going to dab a little bit more water on your finger and dab it along the bottom edge there so that they stick. Okay. And you can start on either end. I typically start on the left side, and I'm going to start coiling this up into a rosette. So you're going to start rolling. At the end, make sure you have a little bit of water at the end so that it seals. Okay. And then you have 1 rose Sumite. And thanks. Did that seem harder than you were imagining, or was it easier than you thought it would be? Okay. Cool. See, if you spend time making like regular dumplings that have different pleats, that can feel a little monotonous, and you feel a little bit of pressure to make sure all your pleats are even. This technically has no pleats. You're just folding dough in half. So,
Can we take a question?
yeah, of course.
Any thoughts on pre-made gyoza or pot sticker wrappers?
I never tell anyone to not do something. Like I think like live your life. I think pre-made dumpling wrappers are great for different instances. Like if you just like want to make dumplings quickly and not spend time making dough and waiting for dough, I think it's really great. If you're interested in kind of that like Like, I find making dumplings really meditative and really relaxing, and I love to make dough. And I like cooking that involves like a little bit of a process. I think making your own dough is really, really rewarding. I think that certain shapes are only achievable with a homemade dough, like the more intricate ones. This one would be fine with pre-made dumpling wrappers. And I think it would be great, especially if you want to like just practice doing it and get the shape down.
We have a question over here.
Do you have to heat them up or something like that?
Do I have to what?
Do you have to heat them up or something like that?
We are going to cook them a little bit later because the meat in here is raw, and so we don't want to get sick. So we are going to heat them up in a second. I am going to demonstrate making another rose in a slightly different style. It's very, very subtle. Let me get this water boiling. Okay. So you can see that the rose sumite that I made is like the petals are open so that you can see the filling inside. And that's like typical of a sumite. It's like an open face dumpling. Some people like the appearance of actually sealing up the petals. So you get like these kind of like really defined petals instead. So if you want to do that, I recommend, I know last time I said don't underfill, but like underfill these just a little bit so that you are able to fully encase the filling. Oh, another thing I remembered about pre-made gyoza or dumpling wrappers, they tend to be a little bigger than what you want for the rose sumite. So instead you can make like, instead of roses, you can make rosettes with just one or two. So they'll just be like a little smaller. Okay, so we have our filling. We're gonna dab our water around like the top edges of our wrapper because we're gonna seal it there. Press the wrapper over, close, press down, and then press down there. Okay. And then again, we're gonna dab water along the bottom edge and then start your coil. So I still have a few, like I have a green onion poking out, but you can see how these are just two different styles of rose sumite.
Could you hold those up to that camera just a bit more so that folks in the back can, yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Good? Cool. All right. So I have a few more, so I'm not just steaming two, but we are going to steam these. You can also pan fry them if you want, but I prefer to steam these because it's the most gentle way of cooking them. You just spent a lot of time making like flower-shaped food, so I think you probably want to preserve your hard work as much as you can, so steaming them is very, very gentle. I'm using a bamboo steamer here, but you can make a steamer setup with like so many other things. Like maybe your pot has like one of those like metal inserts. You can use just a metal steamer instead. For a bamboo steamer, and pretty much any other steamer, you always want to have some type of like non-stick barrier between the bottom of your food and your steamer. So a lot of times I'll just like brush a little bit of oil on here, give it a non-stick coating. I've used this bamboo steamer so much that it actually has a little bit of like, it's like conditioned a little to be non-stick, which is really cool. But otherwise brush it, put some cabbage leaves down, put some perforated parchment paper because you just don't want your dumplings to stick. So we're gonna place them in the steamer. Give them a little bit of space, like they shouldn't be touching each other. Because you want enough kind of like ventilation. You want the hot steam to be able to cook everything pretty evenly. Okay, so that looks like a pretty nice bouquet of dumplings there. And this steamer is the same diameter as my pot. If you have a setup like that, that's the most straightforward, like very seamless steamer setup. If your pot's a little bigger, but your steamer is like able to wedge in there, that also works too. You just want a tight seal. Cool. And then we are gonna cook them for like 7 to 8 minutes. If your roses are really big, then keep them going a little bit longer, like 10 to 12 minutes. Okay, and this is a perfect time for questions because we're just waiting for our dumplings to cook.
You mentioned that we should leave them like cooking for longer if they're bigger. Is there like a use of a meat thermometer or something like that to know if they're cooked, or should we just go by time?
You could use a meat thermometer. Typically, if you don't want to take like the meat temperature should be like 165, I believe, Fahrenheit. But typically, if I'm unsure, I'll just like cut one open, see if like the pork in there is like a little pink, and then if it is, I'll just like put it back in there. And then the broken rose is just like chef's treat. You know, you get to eat it a little bit later.
If you wanted to make these and have them like a week or two later, would you steam them and then place them in the freezer?
That's a great question. So dumplings freeze beautifully as they're like when they're raw. So like after I form them, I had it on like a rimmed baking sheet, just like this, with some parchment paper, just so that they don't stick as much. But what I'll do is if I know that I want to save X amount of dumplings, I'll put it on this sheet and just stick it in the freezer. You don't need to cover it, but once they're frozen solid, it depends on your freezer, but it could take 1 to 2 hours. Once they're solid, you just take them off the parchment paper and throw them in a Ziploc bag and press any air out, seal it up, and they're good for a couple months, depending on how good your freezer is. And they're great. And the number one rule I tell people with frozen dumplings is never defrost your dumplings. Because if you defrost your dumplings, they get like goopy. They like melt a little. Like I would just cook them straight from frozen and add 3 or so minutes to my overall cook time to really make sure the centers are cooked through. Yeah.
Hi. Do you have any tips for if you are cooking for a large group? Do you have like 4 steamers going at the same time, and any tips for how to do that?
So it depends on how you want to handle it. I love cooking for a lot of people. I just live with my dog and my fiance Ruben over there, and as much as I love cooking for just the two of us, I like live for cooking for like 10 to 20 people. That's just like how I'm default like meant to cook. So there's 2 options. You can either get people involved and set up like stations, and I've done that before where there's like, and even in my family, that's naturally how the duties get divided up. Like there's some people who are making the fillings, there's some people who are rolling out dumpling wrappers, there's some people who are cooking, and that'll just speed along the process. And then there's people who are just there to eat, which is fine. So they can take that job, but you can do that, or if you want to do it all yourself, and sometimes I'm in that mood too, where like I just want to do it, I would start like, depending on your schedule, if you have like a day or 2 before, and like make them while listening to a podcast or something, and just freeze all of them. And then when people come over, then you can kind of just like cook them to order as people are coming, and have a friend keep you company, so you're not only just cooking while everyone's having fun. So.
Hi. Is there a difference between the cooking pattern of the open rows and the closed rows?
Not so much. Like there probably is if you like really time it to the exact cooking time, because the meat has more direct contact with the steam. But in this scenario, like it's really not going to make that much of a difference. Also with steaming, because we're cooking with moisture, it's quite hard to like, if something's overcooked, it's still going to have like a little bit of moisture in there, you know what I mean? As opposed to overcooking in a dry setting in like an oven. So you have a little wiggle room when you're cooking this way.
Hi. Oh my God, that's loud.
Hi.
I was wondering, what was the significance behind like this rose shape? Is it just for fun, or is there a hidden meaning to it?
It might be post-rationalized in a way. Like I really love to make food that is visually appealing. I used to be a designer. I went to architecture school, so I love to just like play around with shapes. I also think that making food for people, especially dumplings, like that's kind of how I got my start as a food blogger and how I started Eat Show Food. So that like every weekend I would just like spend time experimenting with dumpling fillings and just make dumplings all the time. And I would give them to my partner or my friends or take them to work. So I think dumplings in general, food is a really great gift. And I thought that like a bouquet, I would rather have a bouquet of dumplings than a bouquet of roses, like any time. And I think it's just like a really beautiful gift to give to someone.
Hi. What is your favorite dipping sauce to make for your dumplings?
That's a really popular question. So my mom makes a really wonderful dumpling dipping sauce. She uses a specific kind of soy sauce, and I think that is why it tastes really good. I think the brand is like Amoy, A-M-O-Y, and it's a seafood soy sauce. So it tastes a little different than like regular soy sauce. It's a little sweeter, and the texture of it's a little thinner. But she takes that, puts like a little bit of sesame oil and a little bit of crushed red chili flakes in there. And there's something about like the salty sweetness, spiciness that's really, really great. If I don't feel like making my own thing, I just reach for the closest jar of like chili oil or chili crisp. I love Fly by Jing or Logan Ma. Like either of those are really, really wonderful.
Hi there, over here.
Okay.
So, kind of maybe unusual question. What part of Cleveland are you from?
I'm from Westlake, Ohio, which is the west side.
Okay. I am actually from the east side, so I'm actually from Ashtabula, which is like an hour away. So.
Yeah, totally.
Yay!
It's funny, the airport, or whenever I go to the airport, the last time I was there, they said it again, but they're like, make sure to grab the right bag, because if you don't, it's probably going to end up in Ashtabula. Like, that's the only time I ever hear it.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you said that there was a dim sum place, I was like, where the hell was that? It's like, where?
Oh, Laiwa is, so have you been to Cleveland Chinatown? It's very small. Okay.
Yeah.
So in, I think the plaza is called Asia Plaza, but it's Laiwa, Liwah, and it's been around there forever.
Okay.
There might be another dim sum spot now, but like they don't exist. Like I only go to Laiwa.
I'm actually going to be going back in August, so I will look for that place.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, do you have bakeries there she should check out as well?
So there's only one bakery, and I've only ever been there like once or twice. It's called Coco Bakery. But I think because of the lack of bakeries in Cleveland, like Coco Bakery didn't show up until a couple years ago. Growing up, there was like, at one of the grocery stores, I can't remember which one, but I can still visualize it, but one of the grocery stores had like this closet size, like this big, with doors and glass doors, and that was the only semblance of like a Chinese bakery that we had. And they only restocked like a few days out of the week, so sometimes it would be like a little stale, so it just wasn't, the situation for Chinese baked goods weren't great. And so my family, we would take road trips from Cleveland to go to Chicago or Toronto, or if we go to Washington, D.C., wherever we went, our first and last stop was always going to a Chinese bakery. In the beginning to stock up on stuff to have for breakfast, and at the end to bring back to our house and keep in the freezer or eat immediately when we got home. So that's kind of, I guess I'm sort of thankful for that void in a way, because oftentimes when you have so much abundance, you kind of like lack that desire to recreate yourself. So.
I heard an interview with you on Food 52's Genius Tapes back in January, and I was so taken with your presence on the mic, I guess. So I was wondering, are there any plans in the future for like a TV show, or do you have an agent?
I mean, I have a literary agent. I'm open to it. I've been approached by a few people about like doing some type of TV stuff, just like waiting for the right opportunity. But it's funny that I used to hate public speaking. Like I used to like be very afraid of it, but I think it changed once I found something that I actually cared about talking about. I think when I was in architecture school or even working in architecture, like as much as I loved it, it wasn't like everything I believed in or like truly, truly loved. And food, no matter if I'm talking to like 100 people or one person or 1,000 people, it just feels really natural just talking to anybody about it.
I think you're very natural, and I would second that. I'd tune in for that. Here's another question, and we're getting towards the end of our
Yeah, we have one more minute on the
program.
steamer, so.
Hi, Kristina.
Hi.
My name is Albert, and I'm an Indonesian Chinese immigrant. And something that I, try to question and grapple with a lot. And my question is, how do you balance keeping authentic to like your roots versus like evolving and transforming new dishes?
Sure. I think that is a ever evolving, I guess, challenge for me. Because even I am Chinese, but I feel like I have a little bit of complexity because I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a primarily Caucasian area of Cleveland. And I spent the first 21 years of my life in Ohio. That's where I went to college, and I didn't move out to California until after that. But I think it's a long story. But like moving here and living in inner Richmond was like the first time that I ever saw people down the street just casually living their lives, and everyone primarily kind of looking like me and hearing languages that were familiar to me. Like being in Ohio, I only ever heard it at my parents' house or at my grandparents' house or going to the few Asian markets. And I lived so much of my life with these two sides of myself, leaning into wherever I was conditionally. But then being in San Francisco, I finally felt a little bit of like that resolution and being comfortable and kind of embracing both sides. And some days I feel a little bit more comfortable on one side or the other, but it's a constant thing I'm kind of thinking about. In terms of like my work and my food, to live authentically is truly just to like trust in yourself and like believe that like what you're doing, like you believe in it. You're not doing something or creating a recipe to prove to anyone, Like I think some of the recipes in this book, I wrote this book for so many people, but it was also for me. And it's my perspective as an Asian American, as a Midwesterner that now lives in California. And I understand that that's not going to really resonate for anyone else. And once you make that decision mentally to be like, I'm going to try my best to connect to all these different sides of me, but if they don't, it's okay because it connects with yourself. So, hope that made sense. I don't know. Okay, the dumplings are done.
Ooh,
okay.
Show us.
So I'm going to open them. Let me bring them to the camera. See this right there. So, yeah. So I can see they're really like nice and juicy. The yellow gets really nice and vibrant. Oftentimes when you're steaming something, the colors get more brilliant as you're cooking them. So these are really hot right now, so I'm not going to eat it right now.
I think
Cool.
we've come almost
Is
to
that
the end. Do you have any last remarks about the recipe for tonight? And I know you're going to sign the cookbooks after.
Yeah,
people
I
of your
am.
books. So
I think I talked a lot about these dumplings tonight, but I hope you feel inspired to make dumplings or work with dough or get a little creative in the kitchen and make food that looks really beautiful. That's always like my motivation in the kitchen and how I like to teach people. So I hope you feel a little bit of inspiration. There was a lot of really thoughtful questions out there, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to stick around, sign books. If you have more questions for me, I am here. I think all the books are sold out now, but if you want to get books, Omnivore has books. I'm going to be signing them later, maybe next week, but I have 2 book signings in San Francisco on Saturday. I'm going to be at the Ferry Building from 2 to 4 if you wanted to grab a book there. And then I'm also going to be at Books Inc. in Laurel Village on Saturday, earlier in the morning from 11 to 1. So in case you weren't able to pick up a book.
Yay.
So,
Thank you.
thanks,
That
guys.
was phenomenal.
Thanks.
You're so great.